We've all come to expect that historical drama, historical film, historical fiction is going to be inaccurate. We all know that the writers, the producers, the filmmakers, they're going to make a lot of stuff up and they're not going to care about historical accuracy. But there is inaccuracy, there is making stuff up, and then there's King and Conqueror, which goes beyond making stuff up. It even goes beyond bad history. Because as it turns out, King and Conqueror is worse than those things. It's a little thing we like to call pseudo-history. King and Conqueror from the BBC and CBS purports to tell the story of William of Normandy and Harold Godwinson in the years leading up to the Norman conquest of 1066. And it fudges that story in a brutal and spectacularly silly fashion. It doesn't just get a lot of things wrong, it gets almost everything wrong. Big things, small things, minor things, major things. It's almost total BS. I won't go into all the inaccuracies now, but some of the major ones include the character of Tostig Godwinson, who in reality was a totally vile person. In the series, he's a complete weed. He's a pushover, he's a wimp, he's a coward, he's not even a snivelling little worm tongue, he's just a waste of space. It completely undercuts what we know about Tostig from history. And there will be spoilers in this video, by the way, just a warning. How he dies is completely silly as well, because he dies at Stamford Bridge, saving his brother Harold's life after Harold gets, attacked by a Dane, and Tostig bursts in, kills the Dane, and then Harold swings around, cuts his throat, and then starts crying over Tostig's, spluttering corpse, which is utter nonsense. The series actually, instead of using Tostig as a villain, creates two other villains with a guy called Morcar, who they inaccurately have as the Earl of Mercia. He was the Earl of Northumbria after Tostig got kicked out. And they have Queen Emma of Normandy, who should have very little to do with the series. Very little to do with this part of history, because yeah, she was scheming a little bit with the Danes, with Magnus and Norway, but she shouldn't have as big a role as she does here, because she's a scheming puppet master out for revenge against Earl Godwin and his sons. It sets up as the reason for her scheming, for her wanting revenge, as the murder of her son Alfred in 1036, allegedly by Earl Godwin. The details of what actually happened are, well, we don't know. This is one of those things which in the series is told through flashback, and they just turn it into a simple Earl Godwin turned up and stabbed him in the eye and killed him thing, when according to all the sources it was more complicated than that. And he was punished for it at the time. He was made to pay a weregild to the king, half a canute, and at Edward's coronation, he was made to pay another weregild. But the series uses this as a pretext for Earl Godwin's exile in the 1050s, instead of going into the more complicated reason for his exile. it was brought up at the time, but there was a lot more going on there than the series lets on. They also get Alfred's name wrong. They call him Aethel. He was an Aethling, which is prince, but that wasn't his name, that was a title. And it leads to Emma of Normandy going, "I want my Aethel back! Where's my Aethel? I want Aethel!" What? There are a lot of inaccuracies in this series. So many, it's almost total rubbish. I mean, even Halley's Comet is... the way they depict it is... I want to say absurd, because it appears after the Battle of Stamford Bridge, and someone goes, "Oh, the comet! It's an omen!" And then Harold just looks at it and goes, "William is coming!" before running off for southern England with his men. Literally, that is what happens. Yeah, but there are two major inaccuracies which overshadow everything else. And the first of these is that it tries to present this idea that William of Normandy and Harold Godwinson were friends. And a lot of other inaccuracies come out of them trying to stretch this idea. It starts at the beginning of the series with a sort of flash forward to the end, and it's the Battle of Hastings, people are fighting, you can't see what's going on because this thing is full of historical cliches. And they have William and Harold in one-on-one combat, sword fighting each other. One reviewer, I think it was for The Guardian, compared the scene to this.
Harold! Answer me, love! Harold! Harold!
The series tries to continually push this idea that William and Harold were friends. It has William attending the coronation of Edward the Confessor. He didn't. He was 15 years old in Normandy, on the run because people were trying to kill him. He wasn't at the coronation, and probably neither were any other members of the Norman court. There's no evidence that there were Normans at the coronation. There were other foreign princes, yes, but no evidence of Normans. And the series has Harold saving William from a Mercian ambush, and that's how they first meet each other, and that's how they get to know each other and become friends. And it continually pushes this idea that they were friends, that they were compatriots, that they knew each other, and they just didn't. There's even a point where they have a homoerotic wrestling match, which, really? You want to go there? The series tries to present this idea that Harold betrayed William by taking the throne, that Harold fractured this friendship, which, you know, it never happened. We've got no evidence for this. There's no proof they even knew each other that well. They met before the Battle of Hastings, perhaps for a few weeks when Harold was in Normandy, and Harold was probably William's prisoner at this time, or some historians argue this. And we don't really know why Harold was in Normandy either. It's because this is a murky part of history. It's muddied by, you know, a lack of reliable sources. It's muddied by conflicting sources, by Norman propaganda, and historians have had to scrabble around in the dirt for details. In fact, they've been going around a bit like this. much everything we know about Harold Godwinson is, yeah, it's basically a pair of glasses in a rock pool. That's pretty much all we know about Harold Godwinson. It's not a lot. But we can probably say for certain that he wasn't friends with William of Normandy. The other thing that's majorly wrong with the series is its lack of continental geopolitical context. It's undermining of the realities of the late Saxon court, of Edward the Confessor's court. Because Edward the Confessor, one of the big issues of his reign was that he surrounded himself with Norman followers, and this was a big source of tension. He surrounded himself with Norman followers, Norman advisors. The Archbishop of Canterbury was a Norman, and people weren't happy about this. But there's no mention of the Norman presence at court. There's no indication of this tension, no sense that it ever happened, no sense of the reality of court life at the time. Because the English court in the 1040s, the 1050s, the 1060s, it was a multinational place. There were Saxons, there were Danes, there were Normans. England was this, it wasn't just this isolated little parochial nation. It was well connected. It was part of a network of states. You had Wales at this point. Wales was pretty much at the peak of its power. Wales isn't even mentioned. Wales doesn't even come into it. And Harold actually, there's a very interesting, very exciting part of his life story towards the end, where he and Tostig go on campaign in Wales and essentially overthrow the King of Wales, Gruffydd ap Llywelyn. But that's not there. There's no mention of the Welsh campaign. There's no mention of links to Scotland. The Danes, they don't come into the story at all. Hardrada is in about 3 scenes and he's a mad barbarian. Which, yes, I can finally use this clip, which I filmed several years ago. I will murder their testicles. Harold Hardrada was one of the most badass warriors who ever lived, and they reduce him to, well, to basically that I just showed you. There's no political context at all, no geopolitical context in the series. It's completely absent. And it seems as if the series is afraid to mention this, to bring it up, to actually include this. And I think the whole reason is that the producers, the writers, the makers of this series are trying to avoid inevitable stretched comparisons with current political discourse, with current political... You know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? It's stretched. It would be a stretched argument to compare them, but the Daily Mail would do it. And I think the makers of this series are trying desperately to avoid that. And to do that, they've removed an integral part of the story. They've removed part of the context. On its own, this would just be bad history. King and Conqueror would be another stupid, fudged, inaccurate historical drama. Were it not for the fact that people involved in this series have been trying to stress that it's accurate, and in particular, they've been trying to stress that William and Harold were friends with each other. And this takes the series beyond bad history and into pseudo-history. Pseudo-history is exactly what you think it is. It's made up history, it's invented history, and it's often invented for political or ideological purposes. It's where somebody at a basic level makes something up and tries to tell you, yes, this is true, this is what happened. Say for instance, I were to tell you that Henry VIII, let's ask a little question. How many wives did Henry VIII have? 6, right? Yeah, cool. How many weddings did Henry VIII have? Now you're thinking, hold on, is it 6? It's got to be 6, right? 6. Wait, did he marry one of his wives more than once? Oh, he married Anne Boleyn in a secret ceremony. Did they have a public wedding later on? Is it 7? Yes. Henry VIII had 6 weddings. It's 6. It's 6. But you could easily convince someone that Henry had 7 weddings. And if you did, that would be pseudo-history. Back to King and Conqueror though, which, as I say, passes into pseudo-history by the fact that the producers, the filmmakers, people involved in the series are trying to stress its accuracy and this idea that William and Harold were friends. And it begins with the historical consultant for the series, a man called Peter Wagstaff, who runs a consultancy called Scenespan. They've worked on things like Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light, and a lot of other Tudor stuff. And they say on their website that they are where historical accuracy meets production reality. We help film and TV teams get the history right. They clearly didn't with King and Conqueror, which they mention in a section of their website called Our Work. And in a little paragraph they say, in this project, history was the script. Brought in during early development, we advised across the script to ensure historical authenticity from the ground up. Story arcs, character motivations, political dynamics, and cultural detail. Set during the Norman Conquest, the series required careful navigation of both Anglo-Saxon and Norman worldviews. Our role helped ground the drama in the lived realities of 11th century power and identity. Clearly, what they're saying here isn't reflected in the series. There is no authenticity in the story arcs, the character motivations, the political dynamics. As I just mentioned, one of the major political dynamics isn't even there. There's no geopolitical context. Cultural detail, it gets cultural detail very wrong. Some of the Normans look more Saxon than the Saxons. Character motivations. Tostig, Emir of Normandy. Story arcs. This whole idea that William and Harold were friends, which, no, they weren't. This is completely at odds with what we see in the series. And this suggests to me it could be one of two things. Either your consulting work was ignored, in which case, what the hell was the point? Your work was for nothing. Or your research, your work was fundamentally flawed. It was bad. It was wrong. It was terrible. And if your research is as bad as what we see here, then I have to ask, what are you doing in the historical consultancy business? You have no business in the historical consultancy business if your research, if your work, if your skills as historians are that bad. Because what we see in King and Conqueror is just plain stupid and silly and off the charts inaccurate. On Sunday morning, just as the series was released, there were a string of newspaper articles, most of them word for word the same article, about the accuracy of King and Conqueror. There was one in the Radio Times which I couldn't actually look at because it was behind a registration wall. There was one in the Daily Express, there was one in the Manchester Evening News, there were some others in a few local papers. The Manchester Evening News and the Daily Express article were pretty much the same, and it's how historically accurate is King and Conqueror. King and Conqueror tells the story of allies turned enemies in the fight for the crown and to become the next King of England. Again, we've got this idea that William and Harold were friends. They weren't. But the article is mainly, it doesn't mention pretty much that the series is total rubbish. It's trying to push that it's a true story, and it's trying to push that it's accurate. And it starts with, it's got a quote from James Norton, who plays Harold Godwins in there, and he says, "I remember being constantly surprised reading scripts and saying, 'Is this real? This seems completely mad.' And invariably, he, the writer, would be like, 'No, that is exactly what happened. It's extraordinary,' James explained. Exactly what happened. No. No, 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 no. Definitely not. He says, 'We know about the broad brushstrokes of Stamford Bridge and the Battle of Hastings. So why didn't you do Stamford Bridge accurately? Or the Battle of Hastings? In fact, we know quite a bit about the Battle of Hastings. Why didn't you do it accurately?' But you don't really get much about an individual from the Bayeux Tapestry and the wider historical facts. The meat and substance is always found in the domestic..." What does that even mean? The meat and substance is always found in the domestic space. What? Again though, it's trying to push this idea that, oh yeah, it was accurate. And then you've got the writer and creator of the series, Mike Johnson, speaking about the research that went into writing the series, and talking about, "It was a question of reading enough to work out what the interesting truths of the story were, the ones that people agreed on, and working out how that could be moulded into a story, because you can't tell a straight documentary version." No, you can't make it a documentary, right? Of course not. It's a drama. It's got to be entertaining. It's got to be thrilling. But none of the interesting truths are in there because it's all made up. It's all nonsense. It's all rubbish. You've included a lot of stuff that comes across like you're trying to make like exciting, shocking Game of Thrones moments. Edward the Confessor being fucked into having a stroke, for instance, which never happened. Emma of Normandy being punched in the face to death, which never happened. The homoerotic wrestling match, which never happened. It's all nonsense. There's no interesting truths in there. None of the interesting truths are in there. And then it goes on to mention one of the executive producers, Kitty Koletsky, who says she was surprised to learn about Harold and William's friendship. We really weren't taught it in school that Harold and William were allies, two friends who became foes. That's because they weren't. That's why you weren't taught it in school, because they weren't. Even after the series was released, even after people started pointing out that it's all nonsense, you have James Norton, who played Harold Godwinson, going on this morning to defend the accuracy of the series. This Morning, for those who don't know, it's like a news chat morning show. It's a daily, one of those daily sofa interview type things. And when it was put to him that the series is a load of rubbish, that somebody, Josie Gibson, asked him whether they needed to jazz the history up, he said, the majority of the history, the big story beats, are all true. Harold looking up into the sky and going, "Oh! William is coming!" Edith, his mistress, mother of his children, identifying his body in a scene reminiscent of CSI, instead of like this. Harold! Harold! William literally planting the arrow in Harold's corpse. Emma of Normandy being punched to death. Edward the Confessor being fucked into having a stroke. None of it is true. The big story beats aren't accurate. They're fudged. They're unrecognisable, almost, from the real history. This is either you don't know for certain because you've not done the research and you've just been told that they're all true, or you know it's bollocks and you're just scrabbling for... you're trying to defend the series. And then he comes up with an excuse for, like, the inaccuracies, saying, of course you have to interpret between the lines because we don't have very much. We have the Bear Tapestry. I think he means Bayer, and I think this is like poor translation, maybe. We have often conflicting accounts of what actually happened. True, the accounts differ. It's a muddy period in history. The accounts do diverge, but there's enough, and historians agree enough, to create... that there is enough material to create a compelling and accurate drama without resorting to, well, Edward the Confessor being fucked into having a stroke, and without trying to push this idea that William and Harold were friends, which Norton then does. What you learn about in school is the Normans invaded England. What we've done is focused on the years leading up to the Battle of Hastings, and what was really interesting was finding out that these two men, William the Conqueror and Harold of Wessex, were friends, and they fought alongside each other at Normandy. No, they weren't. Nowhere in any history book will you find a historian arguing that William and Harold were friends, and especially not in the way this series depicts them as. Not in Frank Stenton, Ian Walker. You can tell I've got a pile of Norman history books on the floor. Peter Rex, Frank Barlow, Robert Bartlett. I've got any more medieval history books that would talk about the Norman Conquest. But basically, no historian, no responsible, respectable historian, no historian worth their salt, not a good historian, not even a bad historian, would argue that William and Harold were friends. And trying to push this idea that they were, trying to continually convince people that they were, and trying to do it through a popular medium such as television, that is pseudo-history. Pseudo-history is dangerous. Pseudo-history is a tool of tyrants. It is a tool of ideologists. It is a tool of people with agendas. It is a tool of people who want to gain something. And it's a growing problem. It's a growing issue that we need to talk more about. Because there's a lot of pseudo-history on YouTube. There's so much pseudo-history on social media. There's a whole lot of pseudo-history on the internet. And by propagating pseudo-history, you actually risk undermining public knowledge. You actually risk undermining actual history. Because how can we get to the truth of the past? How can we understand the past if what is being propagated is nonsense? And as I say, it's the tool of tyrants. It's the tool of bad men. It is the tool of dictators. Pseudo-history is often ideologically driven. And wherever it occurs, we do need to fight it. And I think it needs to be called out, this series. Because it's not just inaccurate, is it? Not when they're trying to convince people that it's true. Not when they're trying to convince people that all of this happened, that William and Harold were friends. No, because they weren't. And anyone who is trying to defend this series as being truthful, not good. So I was just uploading the video, looking for the articles I quoted for the description below. And I came across this new article from the Huffington Post. King and Conqueror stars have their say over one major criticism of the show. One of them is Nikolai Coster-Waldau, who plays William, and he says, "That's a cat." He said, viewers should expect some artistic license. Well, yes, we expect it all. We all expect this kind of thing now with historical dramas. And he does say, this is a work of fiction. It's fiction based on reality and a true story. It's a fictionalized account of what could have happened. Definitely not what could have happened, but at least he's admitting, yeah, it's fictionalized. And then he uses, he compares it to Titanic. But Titanic had fictional characters. I mean, yes, Titanic has its inaccuracies, but the sinking of the ship, it is based on a lot more truth than this is. But oh, who comes back to defend the series again? James Norton. And he says, the truth was they were friends. They met at the coronation. We know that William invited Harold over to Normandy to fight against the Baron of Brittany. He did swear he acknowledged William's rightful claim to the crown over the relics. Whether he meant it or not, we don't know, but much of what we tell, in terms of their relationship and friendship, is true. That's why this is such a brilliant story. Not only is this a massive piece of history, but you have this inherently dramatic friendship-turned-enemy storyline through the heart of it. And then it goes on to quote the This Morning interview. Why is he continually pushing this idea that the friendship was true. Why are they pushing this idea that the friendship was true? No source, no historical source, nothing in the historical record says that they were friends. And if they were, if you ask me, if they had been friends, the Norman sources would have made a big song and dance over Harold's betrayal. They would have shouted it from the rooftops, they would have vilified him, and they don't. I don't know why they're doing this. I really don't. And continually trying to convince people that this is true, this idea is true, that's pseudo-history. That's wrong. That is wrong on so many levels.